Great. Well, let me just, obviously we have different heights here. First of all, thanks very much for the invitation to be part of this panel this morning. This is the title that Michael asked me to talk about. There's no reason here to rehearse the reasons why bioenergy has such an important role to play in our energy system and indeed at the European level. Overall, in terms of renewable energy, biomass or bioenergy is at the European level more than half supplies more than half of the energy. And even though with the renewable energy targets, we're going to see a big ramping up of energy from the renewable sector, biomass will remain almost half of that total. So there is a big increase required, and the issue is really how can we ensure that we produce the required biomass in a sustainable way. What I want to do in my contribution is to look very specifically at the emerging European Union policy framework. I know that for most of you, you're still very focused, and rightly so, on meeting the 2020 targets. But as Michael mentioned in his introduction this morning, this is a sector which is very influenced by policy and the regulatory environment. And the European Union is now putting that regulatory environment in place for the 2030 target. So I think it is important to look at what's being suggested. This is still very much a work in progress, so there are opportunities to influence the outcome. But what I want to try to do is to raise just a couple of questions around what I see coming down the road. Essentially, in terms of 2030, we have the European Energy Policy Framework. I don't know if I have a little laser pointer. Well, you can probably make it out. It's not hopefully too clear, but it's essentially in two packages. So we have the climate package at the top, where we have targets for climate greenhouse gas emission reductions. So the overall target for the European Union as a whole is a 40% reduction compared to 1990. There's also a European Union wide binding target for at least 27% of our energy consumption to come from renewable sources. But that will not be divided by member states. So that's a European Union-wide target. And then there is a European Union indicative target for energy efficiency savings of at least 27% again, compared to business as usual. In terms of the Energy Union part of the package, there are 5 dimensions to this. Energy security, obviously hugely important at the European level, given the uncertainties on our eastern border. So issues here to do with diversification of supplies, greater use of indigenous resources, robust grids, and so on. The second dimension is the integrated market, heavy emphasis on interconnection, which of course is not only contributing to energy security, but it's also a key requirement where you have more variable energy sources coming on the grid. We need that interconnection to be able to balance national systems. Energy efficiency, again, it's also, of course, part of the climate package, but trying to moderate demand and also, of course, try to engage consumers in a more active way to try to also address variable energy supplies. Decarbonizing the economy, the Commission, in its estimates, suggests that the overall costs of decarbonization are not that much different from the costs involved in replacing existing energy infrastructure. Now, I'm not quite sure if that's the case in Ireland, but this is their perhaps rather optimistic view in terms of investment requirements at the European level. And then the fifth dimension is greater emphasis on research and innovation. So I have 4 issues that I wanted just to leave with you for thinking about. The first is These 2030 targets, can we take them as settled, or is there a likelihood that they may actually be changed? One point here is that the European Parliament, in various resolutions, has emphasized the need for perhaps more binding targets, not necessarily more ambitious targets, but more binding targets than the decision taken by the European Council in October of 2014. So they want to see a target of at least 40% reduction in CO2 emissions, at least 30% for renewables, somewhat larger than the 27, and a 40% reduction for energy efficiency, but to be implemented by means of individual binding national targets. Also, the Commission in its proposals and the European Council in its conclusions has opted not to extend the mandatory requirement for renewable fuels in the transport system, the 10% target for 2020, and Parliament has called that should be extended. Now, the question really is the Parliament likely to have any influence? And although the European Council can come with its conclusions, these conclusions are enacted into legislation through the co-decision process, where at least in theory, the Parliament is an equal legislator with the Council of Ministers. Interestingly, we had a similar kind of situation in the most recent reform of the European Common Agricultural Policy, where the European Council, in deciding on the financial framework for the European Union, the 2014 to 2020 framework, which is its remit and its prerogative, it can decide on the figures, but in its conclusions, it actually set out some very specific recommendations also for agricultural policy, which could only be implemented through changes to the basic agricultural acts, which were done by a co-decision process. And the Parliament was very keen that these decisions should not be privileged in some sense, simply because they had been adopted at the European Council level. And the Irish presidency had great difficulty in trying to manage that particular conflict. And in the end, there were some small concessions made to the Parliament, and the Parliament saw this as a victory, in a sense, establishing its position that it had a right also to influence. So all I'm saying is that the basic legislation has still to come in which these targets will be implemented, and the Parliament may have some role to say. We've also had the Paris Agreement. There's some discussion in the light of the level of ambition in that agreement. Should the European Union revise or relook at the overall 40% target? Now, I look around the member states, I don't see any real enthusiasm to do that. And I noticed last week the British Climate Change Advisory Council came out and advised the British government that they saw no need to revise the UK's targets in the light of the Paris Agreement. But again, that's still something that next month the Commission is coming forward with its review of the outcome of the Paris Agreement. It may have something to say on that topic. And the third sort of area of uncertainty, which I'm going to come back to in a moment, is the way in which LULUCF, this is the land use change and forestry sector, will be integrated into the targets. So will a reduction targets in this sector be additional to the 40%? Or, as the Irish government certainly hopes, will they be allowed to contribute towards the 40%? Because particularly the renewable energy target is binding only at the European Union level and not at the member states. And also, of course, there are all these other dimensions in the energy union to do with interconnection, market integration, research and innovation, and so on. The big question mark is, how does the Commission ensure that the member states collectively actually deliver on these targets? Because after all, there is a huge incentive to free ride. You know, why should we invest in research and development if we can get the Germans to do it, drive down the price of solar voltaic cells, and let's reap the benefits? So there is a real issue there in terms of how to get member states collectively involved. And this is the question of the governance of the energy system. And there was some clarification on how this is likely to be driven at the November meeting of the Energy Council. Essentially, the key component here will be the so-called National Energy and Climate Plans, which will be developed in a sort of iterative, consultative process with the Commission. The Commission don't, at the end of the day, have power to fine us on this or to impose, but certainly if we are seen as lagging in a particular area, you can imagine the Commission saying, look, you should be doing more and we really want you to do this. So it will be a sort of a name and shame type of approach rather than a legal and regulatory one. The Council concluded that these plans should first be available at the end of 2019. The Commission had suggested a year previously, so that still leaves quite a lot of time before we actually see the final framework. AFOLU, this is an acronym for agriculture, forestry and land use, and there's still uncertainty as to how this is going to fit into the 2030 framework. There are three options under consideration. One is that this LULUCF pillar, so this is for most of Europe a small net debit. In other words, the sector sequesters carbon. In Ireland in particular, we see this as an important element in our strategy of achieving carbon neutrality in the agriculture and land use sector by 2050. But how exactly will the LULUCF sector be included in the 2030 framework? One option is that we will maintain agriculture as it is at the moment within the under the ESD, the effort sharing decision. Sorry, just went out of my head. We maintain agriculture as it is at the moment under the effort sharing decision, and we create a new pillar with separate targets for the LULUCF sector. A second option is that we put the two together. We have a sort of a land use sector where we have separate targets for agriculture and LULUCF together, and then additional or separate targets for the rest of the non-ETS sectors. Or we simply include LULUCF within the effort sharing decision. There was a consultation on that, and if you look at the responses, they're all over the place. There isn't any evident agreement as to what might be the best way to proceed. The Irish government, in its official response, opted for option 3, because we see the option of using the debits that we hope to achieve particularly from a growing forestry sector, to offset some of the emissions that we have from transport, from heat, and the other sectors in the non-ETS sector. However, the NGOs, particularly the environmental NGOs, are very opposed to this. They argue that there are lots of problems in terms of measurement and monitoring of emissions from the land use sector, particularly on a year-to-year basis, because it's quite influenced by weather conditions in a year. So far better to have a separate LULUCF pillar, which would have its own rules and regulations, and that the emission targets in that sector should be additional, should be on top of the 40%. Okay, so that's a very different outcome, not least from the Irish point of view. And then you have the idea of this land use sector pillar, where agriculture and LULUCF would come together. There's a lot to be said from that from a purely agricultural point of view, because Ireland stands out like a sore thumb. We have such a high percentage of our total national emissions coming from the agricultural sector. So we are forced to address those emissions. Other countries with larger industrial sectors, agriculture is not so important. They can in a sense be hidden. So there's no necessary need to take action in the agricultural sector. And we could find ourselves, in a sense, perhaps penalizing or making our sector less competitive because of the measures that we need to take relative to other sectors. That issue would be minimized. It wouldn't disappear, but it would be minimized if we went for option 2. But as I say, the Commission has to come forward with its proposal probably in late summer, and until then we don't know what the debate will be. Cara has rightly emphasized the sustainability debate in Europe. We know how this has affected the biofuels targets for 2020, where the compromise agreement, the Commission made its proposal in 2012. It took 3 years before the legislation was finally agreed last year, and we know that the requirements for greenhouse gas emission savings from alternative biofuels was strengthened. You can only get public support if you, from I think it is 2017, if you can show that your biofuel source can save at least 60% of emissions as compared to the fossil fuel that you're replacing. You also have sustainability issues to do with biodiversity and vulnerable sensitive areas and so on. And the question is, will we see those kind of requirements also extended to the biomass sector? And indeed, I think we certainly will. The question is, how stringent will they be? How much of a constraint may they put on the types of biomass that will be eligible for support? For example, bioenergy from forest residues or from sawdust, I think will have no problems in meeting showing that they have a significant greenhouse gas reduction. But for energy crops, it might be actually much more difficult. So there are issues there to keep in mind. So in terms of the sort of key messages, although we're beginning to see the framework of European policy by 2030 coming into place, there are still many open questions. One of the big ones, of course, is whether there is a political will to fix the broken emissions trading system. I didn't look this morning what the price is, but it's been around €8 per tonne for some time. Given that if energy users thought that the price was going to go up in the future, they would be buying up emission credits now and driving the price up. So the fact that the price remains stuck in the doldrums suggests that those who are the players in the system don't actually see much change happening over the next 5 years or so. And that is a crucial driver for the whole policy framework. We're still waiting for the individual member state targets for the effort sharing decision. So as I say, it's a 30% reduction for the non-ETS sectors compared to 2005 for the European Union as a whole, but that will vary between 0% for some member states. It could be as high as 40% for others. And the question is, where will the Irish figure emerge? The policy framework for renewables, as I say, although we can certainly develop, and we should be developing, our national strategy, our national targets, but as I say, there will be this process of dialogue with the Commission around these so-called national plans, and they may not be finalised until the end of 2019. This question of how the agriculture and land use sectors will be integrated is going to influence the incentives for the availability of biomass, as indeed will new sustainability criteria. Finally, let me just say, if I still have 1 minute, of course, we've been looking at the energy and climate policy framework, but for farmers, the CAP remains by far the most important policy environment. And here there are conflicting signals. On the one hand, with the direct payment scheme, there is the possibility to hold on to your payment, which is so hugely important in terms of incomes on Irish farms. Even if you plant, if you afforest your land, or if you use your land for energy crops. And that's a very positive thing from the point of view of the bioenergy sector. But there are conflicting requirements. For example, each member state now, under the greening payment, which was introduced as part of that last CAP reform, one of the three conditions there is that member states must ensure that the ratio of permanent grassland to total agricultural area doesn't fall by more than 5% compared to the ratio last year, 2015. Okay, so you can't plow up more than a very small amount of grassland. And explicitly, afforestation, there's a derogation. So if you use your grassland to a forest, no problem. But if you use it for energy crops, that is a problem. Now, that's not going to affect Ireland, where we have plenty of flexibility. But for the European Union as a whole, given, as I say, this huge growth in the demand for biomass, there is a problem that farmers will not be able to convert grassland into energy crops. Bioenergy, I've taken this title from Barry Caslin. He's been a soldier in this area for many years, and one of his early presentations, room to grow. Yes, I think we can all accept that, but we know profitability at farm level remains an issue, including all the other issues which Cara identifies very well in that article that she talked about. I do recommend you take a look at it. The policy regime is critical, and getting that policy regime, I could say more about it, but I've run out of time. But hopefully I've given you a few thoughts in terms of what may be coming down the track in terms of 2030 targets. So thanks a lot.